Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. For your information, you may download a copy of today's slides using the file pod on the left-hand side of your screen. At any time, you may enter questions at the bottom of your screen in the Q&A pod. Today's webinar is not being offered for CME credit, so there will not be a need to do a CME evaluation at the end of the program. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jason Rebholz. Jason is the Chief Information Security Officer with Corvus Insurance. Jason, take it away.
Thanks, Kathy. Appreciate it. So as Kathy mentioned, I am the Chief Information Security Officer at Corvus Insurance. If you look at my background, I was really born and raised in incident response, meaning I spent over a decade responding to different types of hacks and breaches of just about every industry you can imagine, identifying how did they happen? How did the attackers break in? What did they do after they got access into the environment? What did they steal? What did they leave behind? And so now I take that experience and I apply that proactively to not only the Corvus environment, but also all of our policyholders as well. At the end of the day, the goal is to try to secure everyone's environment as best as we can. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, there's three core things that I want to be able to cover. First off is, what's the anatomy of an attack, specifically ransomware? It's all over the news right now, so I want to dig in and try to demystify it and talk through how does this unfold, from how do they get access into the environment to how do they move around to how do they deploy the ransomware. And then we'll dig into the best practices to prepare your environment and your teams for preventing this in the first place. And we have to operate under the assumption that these things are inevitable, but this is about trying to shift the odds in your favor. So we'll talk about what you can do to try to shift those odds in your favor. And then lastly, because I'm going to be throwing a lot of information at you, I do want to try to narrow this down to one of the best single security investments that you can make to just help out against a variety of different attacks, whether it's ransomware or a business email compromise, being when you get a phishing email and somebody's trying to access your email accounts. All right, so let's dig in. Okay, so starting off, let's start with this anatomy of an attack. And again, we're going to focus specifically on ransomware. There are going to be techniques here that will translate into every other type of attack, but at the end of the day, we really want to just narrow our focus in on ransomware, just given how prevalent it is. So when you're looking at an attack, it really starts with how an attacker gets access into the environment in the first place. So the technical speak here is initial entry and establishing a foothold. How do they break in and how do they maintain their access? Now, when we're talking about ransomware, there's really three core methods that we see attackers using to access the environment. Number one, phishing emails. So this is where somebody is sending you an email that's trying to trick you into either clicking a link or opening an attachment. And that attachment then might download some malicious code to your computer, or it might leak some credentials that the attacker could use to log in remotely. But at the end of the day, the main mechanism is sending an email to you, trying to trick you into doing something that's going to then lead to access to your environment. So that's number one. Number two is software vulnerabilities. Now, specifically what we're talking here is about software vulnerabilities on technology that sits at your network perimeter. What does that mean? It means when you have systems that are connecting out to the internet, there's usually only a few of them that are saying, hey, I'm available to the rest of the world, right? So if you have something like a VPN solution, if you're logging into your computers remotely, there's probably some sort of technology there that's being broadcast out to the world, which is totally normal. But attackers will look for software vulnerabilities in those try to exploit them, meaning they run some code to get advantage of this vulnerability, which then gives them remote access into the environment. So that's method number 2. And method number 3 is remote access. This is what I was just referencing, whether this is a VPN, a virtual private network, or any other type of technology that lets you or your employees log in to systems or services that are only available to your inside network. So attackers love this because it's typically the front door into the environment, and so they will target that usually with either stolen credentials, maybe obtained through business email compromise, where they're sending you a phishing email, or they might just brute force the username and password. We see that a lot. It continues to be a trend, and it's something that one of the main reasons why we always recommend putting some additional protections in place there, which we'll get into in a little bit. So once they get access into the environment, whether that is through phishing email, software vulnerabilities, or remote access, then they're looking for a mechanism to maintain that access. Sometimes this is placing some malicious code called a backdoor onto one of your systems or multiple systems that allows them basically a shortcut to log back into your environment. Or they might just try to maintain that remote access. If they got access through that, that could be the main method that they're using to log back in the environment and do what they want to do in the environment. So once they've secured that access, now they start surveilling the environment. And so you'll hear some technical jargon here of elevating privileges. What does that mean? Well, sometimes, depending on how they got that initial foothold, they might only be operating under a specific user account. And so in order to be able to access the entire environment, they're looking for accounts that have administrative access. So these are accounts that your IT team might be using, or your third-party IT provider, or it might just be you, depending how you have the network set up. But what they're looking for is that ability to take a single account that then gives them control over the entire environment. And once they have that account, which they do through a variety of means, they get into this surveillance mode. And I always say that by the end of the attack, the attacker usually knows more about your environment than you do. You know, things that you had thought were reality before, we don't have it set up this way. Nobody can access this particular piece of information. Normally the attacker is able to find a way to bypass that. And so they tend to know what the real reality is because they're testing that. And so as they're going through and surveilling the environment, they're looking for 2 primary things. Number 1 is a central location to deploy that ransomware from. They're looking for a one-to-many. And so a lot of times they're looking for servers that have access to all the other servers, all of the workstations, all of the laptops. And so they're looking for that central deployment point. And then they're also looking for where are your backups? What are your backups? Where are those servers that are managing those backups? Because they know that if you have sound backups, you're not going to have to pay that ransom because you're going to be able to get back up and running very quickly, and you can eradicate the attacker from the environment. So they are actively looking for those backup servers to try to delete those backups, to try to corrupt them. They get a little bit dirty when it comes to these things, and they can get creative to try to stop you from being able to recover. Once they have that and they've got it mapped out, they get everything prepped, and then they're going to do a few different things that's going to accomplish their mission. A lot of attackers now are stealing data from the environment. It's an extra way to kind of twist your arm into paying the ransom. We also see attackers, as I had mentioned, deleting or corrupting your backups. And then once they've got that done, then they go and deploy the ransomware. Once the ransomware is deployed, the jig is up, right? Everybody's aware of an issue, and the response process starts. So they try to lay low, fly under the radar until that ransomware deployment is there. And so that's it. It's a 3 kind of core step process that these threat actors are doing. I'm obviously summarizing this at a higher level. There's a lot of nuances that happen in between. But at the end of the day, this is the narrative that we see time and time and time again on how attackers operate in the environment. So now that we know that, how do we try to protect against that? And it's important to understand that background because security is not a one and done thing. It's not buying one tool and then calling it a day. By looking at how the attackers are getting in, how they're moving throughout your environment, and how they're accomplishing their objectives, we can really dig deep into understanding what are the different security controls that we need to put in place throughout our environment to give us a layered approach to security. And so we talked about how they get in, right? Phishing emails, software vulnerabilities, remote access. So let's start there. How do we try to close that front door? So first and foremost, let's talk about email. I cannot recommend enough using an email security tool or a service, sometimes known as an email security provider or an email gateway. Corvus just released a report last week outlining that organizations that use an email security provider are 2 times as likely to avoid having an issue. Said another way, if you're using something that is poor with an email security provider, or it doesn't have strong security, you're 2 times more likely to be a victim of some sort of phishing attack. So we like to start there. We want something that is looking at the attachments, scanning those to see if there's anything bad in those. Things that are looking at the URLs, the hyperlinks that are in your emails, seeing if those lead to anything poor. And anything that is really giving us a good understanding to really dig deep into what's happening with these emails. What's coming in? How do we block the bad things? Next up is let's make sure we're blocking those malicious file types. When an attacker is trying to send you something that if you double click it, it leads to the installation of a backdoor, we want to try to hide that, right? We want to stop that from happening in the first place. That also leads to Microsoft Office documents. There's probably a lot of Windows users here that are leveraging Microsoft Office, Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel as a main business tool. One of the main things that attackers are doing are using this thing called a macro. It's just commands that they embed into those documents. So you can have your IT provider block those. Say, we don't want anything coming in with that. We don't want to be able to run those. They're not really needed for any real business purpose. So let's just block them. That alone will pay a lot of dividends in securing your emails that are coming in and stop people from accidentally allowing that from happening in the first place. And then we finish here with securing your email with user security awareness training and phishing simulation. So we want to make sure that we're doing some baseline security awareness training. We want to make sure that we're doing some phishing simulations to keep people up to date and really tied in on what they needed to protect themselves. Okay? That's phishing. Next, we shift over to how do we deal with these unpatched software, right? With that, we're looking at risk-based vulnerability management. This, at its core, is identifying and patching those critical risks in your environment before an attacker has a chance to exploit those. This, as we were saying, is especially important for those external-facing systems. Those are the things where, again, these are systems that are facing the internet. Attackers are constantly scanning it. They're constantly looking for ways to try to break in through that mechanism. So we really want to make sure that we can identify those quickly using some scanning technology, using just even vendor notifications. Hey, we've updated our software. We want to stay on top of that and make sure that we're patching those as quickly as possible. In an ideal world, you are patching that within hours of receiving a critical risk from one of your vendors to ensure that you don't become the next victim of that exploit or that vulnerability. Okay? And then last up, we have remote access methods. So there are companies that are using Windows Remote Desktop, RDP for short. So we always recommend that you shift to something that provides a little bit more security, something like a VPN, or there's some new technology that's emerging called Zero Trust Network Access. Essentially what that means is that we are removing trust from everyone and saying, we're going to authenticate you. We're going to allow you to log in based on who you are as a user. You're going to log in. We're going to make sure that there's multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication being something what you have is a username and a password and some other type of authentication method. The most popular ones are a phone app that you have. You can click a button. Sometimes they're a hardware dongle that might have a rotating code. It's called a one-time password. Sometimes it's just a physical dongle itself that could tie into, you can plug into your computer and that will say, hey, okay, you have something in addition to your username and password. So there's a lot of new emerging technology there. If you are still running RDP, we really are recommending to get away from that just because of the additional risk that provides you. And that's where you can shift to a VPN, you can shift to a zero trust network access solution. And we'll touch on some additional services that Corvus can offer, one of those being our vCISO services that can help identify the right solution for you. Okay, shifting gears now. Now that we see that an attacker is, say, in the environment, let's assume that all of those initial protections fail. What do we do, right? So this is where we're really looking at that layered security approach. So first and foremost, let's make sure we have backups, right? That's kind of table stakes in this day and age. We want to make sure that we have a robust backup solution, and this is going to change depending on the size of your environment. If you're a small practitioner and you only have, say, 5 systems, 10 systems, 15 systems, there are cloud solution apps where you can just install something on your computer and that will back it up to the cloud. And that gets you a good just off-site backup there. If you're a little bit larger, this is where we would be looking at some sort of on-premise infrastructure or on-premise solution. There are plenty of options out there. Again, you can use the vCISO services that Corvus provides to get in touch with some vendors who can help you select the right product for you and help get that deployed as well. When you do have these backups, it comes down to protecting them at all costs. Again, when all the other controls fail, if somebody is able to get access into the environment and able to circumvent your initial controls, those backups become your lifeline. They become that last-ditch kind of Hail Mary effort. Let's make sure that we can protect these, get those systems restored, and be back up and operational without any interruption to your business. That's what we're looking for here. So the first thing is segment and secure your on-site backups. Make sure they're protected. Don't have it where somebody can use a standard set of credentials that can access all your other systems to access your backups. Keep them separate. You really want to treat them like precious cargo. When you can, leverage off-site backups. And when I say when you can do it always. Really, in today's day and age, there is no reason why you can't have a simple to use, simple to set up off-site backup using the cloud. Again, this is all going to depend on your environment, but it can be as simple as installing a particular piece of software that will back your systems up to the cloud for you automatically, and then it's as quick as a click of a button to try to get back up and running, pending some transfer speeds and everything like that. But it removes a lot of the art away from trying to restore things and becomes much more of a science, much more of a click the button and let things transfer, and then you're back in business there. Okay. Next up is protecting your endpoints. What do we mean when we're saying endpoints, right? This is your laptops, your desktops, if you have servers in the environment. Those are considered endpoints. It's really anything that you're going to be using for the course of business. Now, there's a particular piece of technology out there called endpoint detection and response. You can think about this like AV on your standard antivirus on just super steroids. It is top of the line. It allows you to really dig deep in identifying suspicious behavior, and it automatically blocks it. And so when we're talking endpoint detection and response, that is really one of the best returns on investments that you can get, because you can deploy that out to your endpoints. It's going to help you if the attacker tries to drop a backdoor, if they try to send you a phishing email that you double click on something that's going to try to run on the system. That can be your first line of defense. And then if the attacker does somehow break that and is able to move throughout the environment, it's there monitoring every system in your environment and looking at all these different suspicious behaviors to piece it together, and it can go and automatically quarantine your systems. It's a containment mechanism. It just stops the attacker from being able to do anything. And so this is something, as I mentioned, it really helps lift the bar for you to make your environment that much more secure. Now, for smaller organizations, you do want to make sure that somebody's paying attention to it. Well, I mean, really every organization. It doesn't matter how big you are. Somebody has to be looking at this to make sure that you're following up on alerts, that you're figuring out What's going on? What's suspicious? And for a lot of companies, this is outside their skill set of the immediate core team and even the IT provider. And so that's where we would look at bringing in a third party that can manage that for you. And again, if that's something that you have questions on that you want to dig deeper into, that's where the Corvus vCISO services can come into play to help guide you through that, so that you don't have to make a guess at this, right? We can remove the guesswork and get straight to what's going to give you the best return on investment there. Okay, and the last thing we have is protecting your credentials, right? And I said before, this is where attackers are really digging deep into getting administrative level access. Again, those are the accounts that allow the attacker to log into any system, access any set of data there. So what we typically look at is invest in a password management vault where you can store these accounts, where you can put MFA in place ahead of that to ensure that people aren't, even whether it's one of your internal users or whether it's an attacker, is not able to accidentally log in and steal your credentials, right? Security is all about putting as many barriers in place for the attacker while balancing the operations of the business. Everything that we talked about here should and can be transparent to the user. They wouldn't notice any real difference in what their day-to-day is, and you're able to achieve a much more secure and a much more resilient environment. Okay, so I gave a little hint out before, right? What's the best return on investment? And I did say before I was only going to give you one, but I lied. I'm going to give you two, right? So I do want to talk about honorable mention. I already dug into this a little bit more, but let's unpack this even more so that you can really understand what is endpoint detection and response. Because candidly, this is one of the more confusing things. It's a confusing concept for a lot of people, professionals included, security professionals included, where when you're looking at endpoint security as a whole, there's a lot of different acronyms. There's standard antivirus. There's next-gen antivirus. There's endpoint detection and response. There's an endpoint protection platform. There are so many acronyms on endpoint security, it can get really confusing. So let's break this down a little bit, okay? Standard antivirus. It's not enough to protect your systems against today's threats. It's just not. It's meant to be more high-level detection, right? So it'll catch the small stuff, right? And that's good. We want to have that. But it's not enough to keep pace with ransomware. So if you're looking at your standard Windows operating system, that will come pre-baked with Windows Defender. That is just your stock AV. That is something that just allows you to basically monitor the small stuff, right? So in response to that, companies, endpoint protection companies, built next-gen AV. What is that? Well, that brings in more heuristic scanning. What the heck does that mean, right? It's more behavior-based. It's looking for anomalies on the system. It's looking for suspicious activity, and it's helping kind of drive things in the direction of, hey, we haven't seen this before, but as we're monitoring and baselining your system, we can see that this is unusual activity, right? Normally speaking, when the attacker is in the environment, they're doing things that normal users don't do. So it's looking for that type of activity. It's looking for little snippets that standard AV just isn't built to do. So it's a really good step in the right direction, but it's individual to the system. It lacks the enterprise features. And so that's where EDR comes into play. It takes all of the detection capabilities of a next-gen AV to be able to detect and block these different ransomware variants and other malicious files that these attackers use these days, and it goes above and beyond. It gives you what we call, at least I call it, flight recorder technology, because that's what it is to me. It's recording everything that's happening at that operating system level so that investigators, if there is some sort of incident, can come in and quickly identify the root cause and figure out across the enterprise what's happening. So it's more of an enterprise-wide or company-wide or all of your systems packed into one. It gives that visibility versus just seeing one system at a time. Said another way, EDR helps expand that scope of the universe of security to give you better visibility. And at the end of the day, visibility is the key to being successful in protecting your environment because you can only protect what you know about. So when we're implementing this, we want to get this on servers and workstations. It is not enough to just say, hey, we don't have servers. We don't need EDR. That's not the case. If you have workstations, if you have anything that you're using day in and day out, we strongly recommend an EDR tool because that really helps lift that security bar in the environment. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, make sure somebody's watching it. If you don't have the skills in-house, invest in somebody to just monitor the alerts and guide you through that to make sure that you have an expert that knows security, that knows this EDR tech, and can guide you on, hey, this is a false positive, or hey, we're seeing this suspicious activity. Is this normal? Really helps kind of put the parameters around everything. Okay, and the winner here is multi-factor authentication. I hinted at this before. I probably said it early anyway, but multi-factor authentication is not the end-all be-all, but it greatly, greatly increases the security, not only of access to your sensitive data, but to access to your email, and you can and should deploy it internally for admin use to help block attackers misusing those accounts as well. So the musts, right? This is where we're looking. Email, as I mentioned, any remote access, any SaaS application, that's a cloud app. Maybe you're using an EMR provider that's cloud-based. If that has sensitive data, make sure that there's MFA in front of it. This really helps up the ante on securing your environment. Now, again, as I mentioned, it's not 100% foolproof, but it's such a big jump in security that it is so worth the investment, and it really can help contain the damage of somebody accidentally releasing their credentials to an attacker via a phishing email, or if their credentials were stolen from a third party, maybe somebody misused or reused some credentials that they shouldn't have. It's helping reduce that account takeover. All right, so when we're talking about an ideal setup for multi-factor authentication, what are we talking about here? And there's a lot of technical mumbo-jumbo in here, so I'm going to break this down. Okay? First up, a single sign-on solution. What is that? Well, you have a central place that highlights how you can log into systems and what systems you can log into. A good example of this, I'm sure a lot of people might use social media. Maybe they use Facebook. Maybe they use Twitter, whatever it is. Those typically those social media providers provide this capability that, hey, you can log into this other application using your Facebook password. That is an example, albeit a poor one, of single sign-on solution. So ideally what you have is an enterprise solution, something like an Okta or a Duo, where you can go in, manage that, say, hey, we have a new employee starting. We want them to have access to all these apps. And with a click of a button, they have access. And you can manage that. You can monitor it. It gives a lot of visibility into it. On the inverse, if somebody leaves your organization or your practice, then you can say, hey, so-and-so just left our company. With a click of a button, I'm going to remove their access. And that goes for all the different things that you have configured there. So that's why we like that as kind of the first line of defense. Then the MFA that's based on a device. So this could be your mobile phone. There's plenty of apps out there. Again, Okta, Duo have apps. There's Microsoft Authenticator. Google Authenticator. There's Microsoft Authenticator as well. So there's plenty of options that are out there that allow you to use your mobile phone as that second factor. It's something that you have. And then between the two of those, this is where you're looking for unusual login activity, right? Some people will say, hey, this is conditional access. Sometimes this is looking for something where I only expect Joe to log into the office from Texas, and all of a sudden we're seeing logins from California, and then in Germany, and then wherever else. That's a sign that, hey, his credentials may have been compromised. So we like to look for things like that, weird times, things of that nature. A lot of technology now has that baked in. So that's why we see MFA authentication as the clear winner. Okay, so that's what we have. We went through a lot. I do see that we have a couple questions, so I'm going to jump straight into that right now. So we do have a question around whether a VPN account offers any protections. So it depends, right? It depends what you're using it for. So many companies today will use a VPN to access their environment, right? And so there's a few benefits that it provides. One is it forces them to log into your environment through controls that you have. So you force MFA on that. So you can get some security right off the bat, but saying we're only going to allow you to connect using MFA through our VPN. The other additional benefit here is that it does encrypt all the traffic, so it's just a good safety measure if something is, for whatever reason, not going over the wire encrypted. So it does offer protection. There are other solutions out there that are just as secure, just like the Zero Trust network access. So there you have options depending on your organization. Okay, we have another question here on what endpoint software do you recommend for the home office? So I typically will recommend that whatever you're using for your corporate environment, you are using for your home office as well. And this can get a little bit weird for some of your employees because they're saying, hey, you know, I don't want you to put that on my personal device. And if that's the case, I typically will say you're only allowed to access the network from a trusted device. That's something that I say you're allowed to log into using technical controls and policies. So normally what I say is that for anyone accessing your environment, make sure that they have that EDR. If you're just looking for your home office of, you know, the general run-of-the-mill kind of web browsing, you're not using it to access company resources, typically what we see is some sort of investment in a basic next-gen antivirus. You know, they can typically be fairly affordable for private offices or for homes, and it just gives you that extra level of security there. So, you know, we see Malwarebytes is probably one of the more common ones that I see for the home use. They do have a next-gen AV solution for that, and so that's where I would see people going to try to invest in there. But there's plenty of options that are out there. It can be a bit of a minefield to navigate that. So typically what I'm looking for the home use is give me some additional protections that's looking for things that aren't known. And that's typically where next-gen AV comes into place. Okay. So that's
Thanks,
all the
Jason.
questions that we have here.
I've got a couple.
So I appreciate the time from everybody today and looking forward to answering any future questions that you might have.
Hey, Jason, I have a couple of questions that were sent in.
Oh, perfect.
TMLT policyholders now receive a Corvus scan the month after their MedMal policy renews. Can you talk about the importance of the scan and what a practice should do with it once they receive theirs?
Yeah, so you should really look at that Corvus scan as a good baseline of where you are at and where some critical issues are. It's not comprehensive, right? It's not going to catch everything under the sun, but what we look to do is really bubble up the most important things. So you will see, hey, you have RDP exposed to the internet. We need to fix that. Or you might see, hey, there's a critical vulnerability that you have that threat actors are actively exploiting. We need to fix that. And then it goes into other best practices on just, you know, general good security hygiene. And so when you receive that report, we strongly encourage you to look at that and see what's changed since the last month. Is there anything that we need to invest in more from a security perspective, right? Is there anything new that came up that we need to be addressing? So it really is a good mechanism and a good practice to take a look at that report and just say, what's changed and what can we do to fix that to make sure that it's not an issue moving forward?
Great. A follow-up to that is the Corvus scan is not penetration testing. Is that correct?
That's correct. It will touch on some elements of what happens in a pen test, but it is not considered a comprehensive pen test. So we would still encourage organizations to invest in a pen test at least annually. For smaller practices, maybe a little bit further between, and that guidance is going to vary depending on different regulations that you have. So, you know, it's really making sure that you know what you're required to do. Typically, I see that as an annual thing. So we do encourage you to invest in that because that will pick things up that our scans will not, because it's meant to be more active, more aggressive. So they're going to be able to turn rocks over that typically our scan will not try to do. Just so that we can maintain our passiveness on our scanning technology.
So there's another question that's come in. Do you see issues from VoIP, VoIP from attackers?
So we have not seen VoIP be that's voice over IP. That's your phone systems that are operating over the internet. So I have not seen that as an initial attack vector. However, what I have seen is attackers, if you have an internal voice server, this is for much larger organizations, sometimes that just gets compromised as a course of the attacker doing their thing. Never really intentionally. I'm sure at some point it has, but we typically don't see that as a significant risk. But that being said, especially for smaller offices that are using some cloud provider VoIP system, that's where we'd still recommend that you have MFA in front of that for your users and administrators that are logging into that.
Thanks. You mentioned the uh, Corvus's virtual CISO program for policyholders. That includes all of TMLT's policyholders as they come on and actually as they renew after July 1st. I'm just going to throw up the website of where you go for more information on that program, as well as if you have other questions about the TMLT cyber consulting services. You mentioned high risk vulnerabilities, and TMLT is taking an extra step with those, working with Corvus. So when Corvus identifies a high risk vulnerability, someone from TMLT's cyber consulting services team actually is calling policyholders to let them know that they have a high risk vulnerability and help them get started with the remediation of that. I'm looking to just double check to see if we have any other questions coming in, and I don't see any at this time. Just a reminder, this excellent webinar has been recorded and you'll receive a link to the recording within about 24 hours. Also, all of our webinars are posted on the TMLT Resource Hub. We will not be having a webinar the week of Thanksgiving, so our next webinar will be Tuesday, December 14th. Jason, we can't thank you enough for a great presentation and for answering questions from our audience. Thank you to everyone who joined, and we look forward to seeing you again in December. Thanks, everyone.